When you are in danger, you are told to call the police, file a report, get a restraining order, document everything, and let the system handle the rest. That is the agreement. But for the victims in these cases, that agreement meant nothing. They called, they handed over evidence and described the threats, some of them dozens of times. And then they lost their lives by the exact person they had reported. Not by a stranger, by the name already sitting in the file. These were not hidden warning signs that slipped through the cracks. Officers received detailed complaints. Courts issued protective orders. Agencies logged increasing danger and did not act on it. The records existed at every level, and at every level it failed to become protection. Independent investigations later confirmed system-wide breakdowns in case after case. Misconduct findings were issued. Institutions paid millions in settlements. Laws were rewritten. Today, we are covering 10 victims who reported the person who harmed them to police and were ignored. What you are about to hear will show you what happens when every warning is filed, recorded, and documented, and none of it is enough to prevent a tragedy. Case 1. Shana Grice. In early 2016, Shana Grice was 19 years old and living in Brighton, East Sussex. She had recently ended a relationship with a man named Michael Lane. For most people, the end of a relationship is painful but temporary. You grieve, you adjust, you move forward. The person you were with becomes part of your past. You build a new routine. You reclaim your space. Shana was trying to do that. She was 19. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was trying to move on. Michael Lane was not. He sent persistent, unwanted messages. He showed up uninvited at places she went. He tried to monitor her movements. He applied constant emotional pressure. The separation Shana had chosen was not being respected. The space she tried to create between them was closing around her. What should have been a clean break was becoming something else entirely. Stalking risk assessment frameworks in the United Kingdom identify ex-partner stalking as one of the highest risk categories of threat, particularly when the offender refuses to accept the end of the relationship. The refusal to let go is not a personality flaw or an expression of attachment. It is a warning sign. Lane's behaviour after the breakup, the messages, the showing up, the monitoring, match the pattern that those frameworks are designed to flag. In February 2016, Shana went to Sussex Police for the first time. She described what Lane was doing. Officers treated it as a lower-level domestic matter. Lane received a verbal warning. He was not charged. The report was handled as a single, contained event, logged, noted, and set aside. No ongoing case file was opened. No one tracked whether Lane stopped or continued. He continued. Then he got worse. Shana reported that Lane had placed a tracking device on her vehicle. This was not an impulsive act. Purchasing a tracker, accessing her car without being seen, placing the device. Each step required deliberate planning. It required access to her vehicle. It required knowledge of her routine. The behaviour had shifted from emotional harassment into physical surveillance, from unwanted contact into active, real-time monitoring of where she was and where she went. Stalking risk frameworks in the United Kingdom identify this transition as one of the clearest warning markers, signalling that the offender has moved beyond reactive behaviour and into planned control. Officers did not elevate the threat level. The report was received. The response did not change. After that, Shana reported that Lane had entered her home without permission. He had watched her sleep. This was yet another step up, and one that stalking risk assessment procedures treat as among the most dangerous. The offender had crossed from external harassment into the most private and vulnerable space Shana had. She was no longer safe in public, in her car, or in her own bed. The significance of a home intrusion in a stalking case goes beyond the violation itself. It demonstrates that the offender has both the capability and the willingness to access the victim when she is at her most vulnerable. It shows that physical barriers, locked doors, private spaces are not deterring him, and it introduces a new psychological dimension. The victim now knows that nowhere is safe. Sleep, which should be the most protected and private state a person experiences, has been invaded. The message is not subtle. It is a demonstration of total access. Lane was arrested for stalking, released under investigation. No safeguarding plan was created. No officer was assigned to manage the case. No monitoring of Lane was put in place. The system briefly engaged at the level the danger required and then disengaged before anything lasting was established. 5 reports in 6 months: harassment, surveillance, home intrusion, and arrest for stalking, each one worse than the last. None of them triggered a reassessment. Instead, officers treated each complaint in isolation. They responded to the report in front of them, without reading it as part of the story Shana had been telling them for months. 5 separate reports, 5 separate responses, no complete picture. During one complaint, Shana did not initially disclose that Lane was her ex-partner. Officers accused her of misleading them. Rather than focusing on the danger she was describing, they turned their attention to her credibility. She was fined £90 for wasting police time. Officers described her complaint as a possible smokescreen. The fine reveals something about how the system was oriented. The question officers were asking was not, "Is this woman in danger?" It was, "Is this woman telling the truth?" Those are different questions, and they lead to different actions. The first question puts the focus on the threat. The second puts the focus on the victim and turns her into a subject of review rather than a person to be protected. Shana had come to the police 5 times. Each visit was a choice to engage with a system that was not responding. The fine punished her for that engagement. It told her that persisting, that continuing to show up and report, had consequences for her, not for the man she was reporting. The focus had shifted entirely. It was no longer about the man who was stalking her. It was about whether she was a reliable enough witness to deserve protection. A 19-year-old who had gone to the police 5 separate times, who had reported a tracking device, a home intrusion, and sustained stalking, was fined for asking for help. The period between the fine and what happened was less than 2 months. During that time, Lane's access to Shana had not been restricted in any meaningful way. No monitoring was in place. No safeguarding measures had been established. The fine had sent a message, not to Lane, but to Shana, about what happened when she reported. The system that was supposed to protect her had penalised her for using it. Whether she continued to report during those final weeks is not publicly documented. What is documented is that the threat was still active and unchecked when the final day arrived. On August 25, 2016, Michael Lane entered Shana's home for the last time. He cut her neck. He set fire to the property, an act that investigators noted was consistent with an attempt to destroy evidence or delay discovery. Emergency services responded. She died at the scene. She was 19 years old. Lane was found guilty of the charges in 2018. Life imprisonment, minimum term of 25 years. The court heard detailed evidence of the stalking, every one of the prior police reports, and the pattern that had been visible in the records for months. The Independent Office for Police Conduct concluded that Sussex Police committed serious errors. The 2018 investigation by the Independent Office for Police Conduct laid out the failures with precision. Officers had treated each of Shana's 5 reports as a separate incident, rather than recognising them as a growing course of conduct. The pattern was visible in the records, but only if someone read the reports together rather than in isolation. No one did. The risk grading never reflected the actual severity. Despite the warning signs present, surveillance, intrusion, obsession, the case remained at a lower rating throughout. The inquiry found that officers questioned her credibility rather than focusing on the offender's conduct. 2 officers were found guilty of gross misconduct. Sussex Police formally apologised to her family. Her case became a turning point in how stalking complaints are evaluated across the United Kingdom. It contributed to greater review of stalking risk assessment models, in particular how officers are trained to recognise warning patterns, rather than treating each complaint as a standalone event. It led to stronger internal training on victim credibility bias, the principle that a victim's account should be evaluated based on the threat described, not on whether the officer finds the victim personally convincing or credible. It led to national public awareness campaigns about stalking. Domestic harm advocacy groups cited her case repeatedly as proof that the system underestimates the danger posed by ex-partner stalking, particularly when the victim is young and the complaints are treated as low-level domestic matters rather than as warning signs of deadly risk. Shana Grice was fined for reporting her stalker, but the next victim contacted police more than 20 times in 10 days and still could not get them to run a basic background check. Case 2. Lauren McCluskey. In the fall of 2018, Lauren McCluskey was a senior at the University of Utah. She was 21, studying communication, and competing as a nationally ranked track and field athlete. She had the kind of schedule that looks like a life being built. Classes, training, meets, plans for after graduation. She was months away from finishing her degree. Her future had shape and direction. In September, she started dating a man named Melvin Rowland. He told her he was younger than he was. He lied about his background. He misrepresented who he was. Lauren later discovered the truth. Rowland was 37 years old, 16 years older than she was, and a registered offender. His prior conviction involved coercion and crimes involving a minor. He had a documented history of manipulative behaviour. The deception was not minor. It was structural. Rowland had constructed a false identity to gain access to a 21-year-old college student. The age gap, the criminal history, the offender registration. Any one of those facts, known up front, would have prevented the relationship from beginning. Rowland knew that. The lies were not casual omissions, they were deliberate concealment of the exact information that would have caused Lauren to protect herself, which is precisely what she did the moment she learned the truth. All of that information was publicly accessible through state databases. A basic criminal background check, the kind that takes minutes to run, would have revealed it immediately. Lauren ended the relationship as soon as she learned the truth. That decision marked the beginning of what came next. Rowland did not accept it. The relationship was over from Lauren's perspective, but not from his. What followed was not the behaviour of someone processing a breakup. It was targeted, growing, and deliberate. Rowland demanded $1,000 from Lauren. He threatened to release intimate photos if she did not pay. This was not an idle threat made in anger. It was blackmail, a calculated demand backed by the threat of image-based threats. The combination of blackmail and threatened image release represents a specific and recognised pattern of coercive control. The offender uses private material as leverage to maintain power over the victim after the relationship has ended. It is designed to keep the victim trapped, afraid to walk away completely because of what the offender holds over them. Lauren went to campus police. She reported the blackmail and the harassment. She gave them Rowland's name. She provided screenshots and digital proof of the threats. She told them she was afraid. Between October 12th and October 22nd, she contacted campus police more than 20 times. 20 contacts in 10 days. Each one logged. The background check that would have revealed who Rowland actually was, a registered offender with a history of coercion, was not run in time. The case was not assigned to a detective. What those 10 days looked like from Lauren's side. She was still attending classes, still training, still maintaining the schedule of a student athlete finishing her senior year, but alongside all of that, she was also calling the police, again and again, trying to get someone to act on the threat she had already described and documented. The combination she was reporting, blackmail, threatened release of intimate images, and ongoing harassment from a man whose real identity she had already uncovered, represents a cluster of risk factors that domestic harm researchers recognise as warning signs of serious harm. Lauren was providing clear evidence. The urgency of what she described was not matched in the response she received. What those 10 days looked like from the systems side. The case sat without detective assignment. The background check that would have immediately revealed Rowland's criminal history and offender registration, information that would have transformed the risk picture, was not conducted promptly. Each day that passed narrowed the window for action. In one instance, an officer shared Lauren's private photos with colleagues outside of any investigation-related purpose. Lauren had trusted the institution with sensitive evidence, images she had handed over because she believed they would be used to build a case against the man threatening her. Instead, they were shared casually. That trust was violated from the inside. The officer was later disciplined and fired, but the damage to the victim's relationship with the institution she was relying on to keep her safe, had already been done. The violation raised a broader question about the culture of the department handling her case, and whether her situation was being treated with the seriousness it demanded. On the evening of October 22nd, Lauren returned to her residence hall. Rowland was waiting outside the building. He took her life. He fled. The campus was locked down. Police later found Rowland in a nearby church. He was found as officers closed in. Lauren was 21. She had been a nationally ranked athlete with a degree almost finished and a future that had shaped in direction. 10 days of calls, a name, digital evidence, and a clear description of the danger. None of it moved fast enough. The university commissioned an independent public safety review. The findings were unsparing. Multiple missteps across the campus police operation, breakdowns in communication between officers and departments, a time-sensitive situation treated like routine paperwork. The panel concluded that better action may have prevented the later deaths. In 2020, the University of Utah paid $13.5 million to Lauren's family, one of the largest campus safety settlements on record. The university acknowledged organizational failures publicly. It created a threat assessment and management team designed to evaluate threats in a coordinated way, the kind of teamwork that did not exist when Lauren was reaching out. It required background checks in cases where a student reports threats from a partner, the step that was not taken in time for Lauren. It established faster upgrade procedures so that cases involving imminent danger would not sit unassigned. It rewrote stalking and blackmail response procedures to address digital threats, and image-based threats in particular. Her case became nationally cited in discussions about campus police authority and its limitations. Campus police forces operate differently from municipal departments, and questions arose about whether campus officers had the training, resources, and organizational support necessary to handle serious criminal behavior. The case also became a reference point for organizational responsibility. The legal and moral responsibility an institution bears when warning signs are documented, reported, and not acted upon. Her family became vocal advocates for campus safety reform, pushing for changes that would prevent another student from falling through the same gaps. McCluskey's campus police failed to act on digital evidence, but the next case shows what happens when the legal system itself forces a victim into the same room as her offender. Case 3. Carli. On March 27, 2022, Carli drove to a restaurant parking lot in Navarre, Florida. She was 37, a mother. She was there to hand her young daughter to her former partner, Marcus Spanavello, for a scheduled custody exchange, the kind of meeting their court arrangement required on a regular basis. It was routine. It had happened before. The parking lot was public. Other people were around. For anyone watching from the outside, it looked like an ordinary handoff. One parent arriving, the other leaving, the child passing between them. It was the kind of moment that happens in parking lots across the country every day. Cassie never came home. The relationship between Carli and Spanavello had been getting worse for a long time. Court records reflected custody disputes and documented conflict between them. There had been prior injunctions, formal legal actions taken to restrict Spanavello's behaviour. There had been court involvement regarding both custody and conduct. Law enforcement had responded to earlier domestic disturbances involving the two of them. Carli had sought protective measures through the legal system on multiple occasions. The records were extensive. The courts knew the history. The legal system had been engaged. The conflict between them was not a secret. It was on the record. Despite all of it, the custody arrangement still required face-to-face exchanges. No police-supervised protocol existed. No monitored facility was required. No legal mechanism forced the meeting to happen at a protected location. A public parking lot was considered sufficient. The logic behind public locations is that the presence of other people creates a form of passive safety. That logic has a critical flaw. It assumes that the presence of witnesses prevents harm. In reality, the presence of bystanders does not stop someone who has already decided to act. A parking lot does not have security personnel trained to intervene in domestic harm situations. It does not have cameras aimed at every angle. It does not have any system to verify that both parties leave safely. It does not call for help. It is simply a place where other people happen to be. People who may not recognize what is happening, may not know the history, and may not intervene even if they do. Domestic harm researchers consistently identify custody exchanges as one of the most dangerous moments in abusive dynamics. The victim is required to be in physical closeness to the offender at a known time and location. The offender knows exactly when and where the victim will be. The victim cannot avoid the meeting. The court order requires it. The emotional stakes of custody. Control over a child. Add tension to a situation already defined by prior conflict. At the time of Cassie's death, Florida law did not require that this kind of high-risk exchange take place at a supervised facility, even when the court records documented a history of conflict and protective measures. After the exchange time passed, Cassie stopped responding to her family. Her vehicle was later found abandoned. Spanavello, meanwhile, returned to Alabama with their daughter. The hours between Cassie's arrival at the parking lot and the discovery that something was wrong represent the gap that the legal system had failed to fill. She had driven to the meeting point. She had done what the court order required, and at some point during or after the exchange, she lost her life, in the kind of location the court had treated as safe enough. The people in the parking lot, if there were any, did not intervene. There was no officer present, no camera system monitored the exchange, no check-in procedure existed to confirm that both parties left the location alive. When authorities contacted Spinks, they identified conflicting details in his story almost immediately. He provided conflicting statements about what had happened. He was arrested. On April 2nd, 2022, 6 days after Cassie disappeared, investigators found where she had been left in a shallow burial site in Alabama, near property connected to Spinks' father. She had been attacked and lost her life shortly after the custody meeting. The exchange that was supposed to be routine became where she was harmed. Every exchange was a known appointment, a scheduled moment when Cassie was required to be in closeness to the person she had sought protection from. The court knew the history. The arrangement still required her to show up. Spinks was charged in connection with the attack and evidence tampering. In 2023, while awaiting trial, he took his own life in jail. He never faced a courtroom. There was no trial, no verdict, no sentence. The fatal meeting happened during a legally structured exchange, and no safeguard existed to prevent it. This case differs structurally from the others. Law enforcement responded quickly once Cassie disappeared. The failure was not in how police handled a final complaint. It was in fact that no mandatory safeguard existed to prevent a known dangerous situation from becoming deadly. The system had all the information it needed to classify this exchange as high risk. Injunctions had been filed, court records reflected the conflict. Law enforcement had responded to prior disturbances. The custody arrangement still sent Cassie to meet Spinks in a parking lot with no structured protection. The gap was not between a complaint and a response. It was between documented danger and the absence of any physical safeguard at the moment of greatest risk. Following her death, Florida lawmakers passed Cassie's Law. It requires courts to consider ordering safe exchange locations in custody cases involving domestic harm. It expands a judge's choice to require supervised exchanges and places greater emphasis on risk-informed custody procedures. Before the law, judges in Florida had limited tools to require secure exchange conditions. Even when the case history clearly indicated danger, the law gave courts explicit authority to order safe locations and expanded the range of protective measures available. Domestic harm advocates noted that the law represented an important shift in how the legal system treats custody logistics. For years, the focus in custody proceedings had been on the terms of the order itself. Who gets the child, when, under what conditions? The safety of the physical exchange had been treated as secondary, something handled informally through public meeting locations, rather than through structured, enforceable procedures. Cassie's Law acknowledged that the exchange itself can be the most dangerous moment in an abusive custody dynamic, and that the legal system has a responsibility to protect victims during that moment, not just in the paperwork that surrounds it. Carli engaged the legal system. She filed for protection. The courts recognized the danger. The law still required her to meet the man she had sought protection from in a parking lot with no safeguards. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. Carli's case led to a new law in Florida, but the next case is still unfolding, and the investigation into what went wrong has not yet concluded. Case 4. Courtney Mitchell. In August 2024, Courtney Mitchell was 26 years old, a mother living in Ipswich, Suffolk. She had been in a relationship with a man named Logan Burnett. The relationship ended. What followed was a pattern that by this point in the series carries a familiar weight. Threats to take lives, reported breaches of contact restrictions, growing intimidation. Burnett had previously been arrested in connection with threats against her. Restrictions were understood to be in place limiting his contact with Courtney. Family members reportedly contacted police multiple times before what happened. There were reports that her property had been ransacked shortly before the fatal day. Contact restrictions only function as protection if they are enforced, and if violations are detected and responded to with speed. When an offender breaches those restrictions without consequence, the restrictions lose their power to stop him. They become documents that describe what should happen, rather than mechanisms that prevent what will happen. On the same day as the attack, Further concerns were communicated to authorities. Courtney lost her life in broad daylight in the town centre of Ipswich. The setting matters. This was not a crime committed in seclusion or behind closed doors. It happened in a public space, during the day, in view of the community. That choice, or that loss of restraint, suggests the offender had moved past any concern for consequences or concealment. In domestic harm danger research, a public attack is often the final stage of a warning pattern that began with private threats and progressed through increasingly brazen behaviour. The transition from private threat to public aggression indicates that the offender's intent has overtaken any remaining self-preservation. Emergency services responded. She was pronounced dead from injuries. Burnett was arrested and charged in connection with the attack. Court proceedings are ongoing under UK reporting restrictions. Following what happened, the Independent Office for Police Conduct confirmed it would investigate Suffolk Police's handling of prior domestic harm reports, risk assessments, safeguarding measures, and the police response on the day of the attack. The IOPC's role is to determine whether officers followed correct procedures, whether risk was properly assessed, and whether any misconduct occurred. No final findings have been published. What is publicly known is the list of risk factors present before what happened. Prior death threats, recent property damage, reported breaches of restrictions, ongoing harassment after a relationship breakdown. Domestic harm cases ending in death reviews across the United Kingdom have repeatedly found that death threats are among the strongest individual predictors of deadly harm. When multiple high-risk factors are present at the same time, the risk profile is considered severe. The IOPC investigation will determine whether those warning signs were assessed at the level they warranted. This case differs from the earlier historic cases because both the police conduct investigation and the criminal trial remain unresolved. No misconduct findings have been issued. The IOPC investigation will examine whether officers followed correct procedures when the family contacted them, what happened on the day of the attack, and whether the response to concerns communicated that day was adequate. The answers will determine whether this case follows the pattern of confirmed system failure or whether the response met the standard the situation demanded. Courtney Mitchell's case is still under investigation, but the next one goes back to the 1980s, and it involves a man who survived an attack by a serial offender, walked into a police station, named him, gave the address, and was ignored. Case 5. Carl Stotter and the victims of Dennis Nielsen. In 1982, Carl Stotter went to a flat in London belonging to a man named Dennis Nielsen. At some point during the evening, Nielsen choked him until he lost consciousness. Then he tried to hold him underwater in a bath. Stotter survived. He regained consciousness and lived. Most of the men who entered that flat did not. Between 1978 and 1983, Dennis Nielsen took the lives of at least 12 young men and boys in London. He later claimed there were more. His pattern was consistent. He lured men to his home, he choked or held them underwater, he concealed what was left inside his residence, he later disposed of what was left. This continued for years, across 2 different London addresses, without detection. By the time Stotter was attacked, Nielsen had already taken multiple lives. The evidence of those crimes was inside the flat, the same flat Stotter had walked into and survived. After surviving, Stotter went to the police. He described being choked until he blacked out. He described the attempt to hold him underwater in the bath. He identified Nielsen by name. He gave the address. He was not reporting a vague feeling of unease or a minor altercation. He was describing specific, dangerous acts that had nearly ended his life. Choking and being held underwater, both recognised across law enforcement as direct warning signs of deadly intent. Choking in particular is one of the most significant red flags in dangerous cases. A person who chokes another person is demonstrating a willingness to take lives. The report Stotter filed described exactly that. Police classified it as a domestic dispute, a quarrel between 2 men who had been drinking. That rating was the gatekeeper. In policing, the initial labelling of a complaint determines the entire path of the response. Which unit handles it, what resources are allocated, what investigation powers are available, and whether the case is treated as urgent or routine. A domestic dispute between 2 men who had been drinking goes into one track. An attempt on someone's life goes into another. Stotter's report described the latter. It was labelled as the former. Everything that followed, every failure to investigate, every door left unopened, flowed from that single decision. Inside that flat, the one Stotter had identified, the one where he nearly died, evidence of his crimes was hidden. A warrant would have found them. A different rating, one that reflected what Stott actually described, would have triggered a different investigation. That investigation would have led officers to Nilsson's door. Behind that door, they would have found what a plumber eventually found months later. The connection between Stott's testimony and the evidence inside the flat was separated by nothing more than a warrant that was never requested. Nilsson remained free. He continued taking lives. Men who were alive on the day Stott filed his report were dead by the time Nilsson was caught. The gap between the dismissed reports and the eventual arrest was months. Months during which more people were harmed. The victims Nilsson harmed after Stott's report were, by all accounts, young men in the same vulnerable circumstances as those who came before. Often isolated, sometimes homeless, targeted precisely because they were unlikely to be immediately missed. Each one entered the same kind of situation Stott had survived. None of them walked out. The fact that a survivor had already identified the offender and the location, and that this information sat in a police file, classified as a minor domestic dispute, makes every subsequent death a failure with a specific, identifiable origin point. He was not caught because of detective work. He was caught because of a plumber. In February 1983, a plumber investigating blocked drains at Nilsson's Muswell Hill flat found what was left of his victims in the pipes. The discovery was accidental, a maintenance call that happened to intersect with a crime scene. Police attended the property. They found more evidence inside. Nilsson confessed when confronted. He admitted to multiple attacks. The irony is sharp. A 5-year series of attacks that a police report could have interrupted was ultimately ended by a plumbing problem. The criminal justice system had the information it needed, a survivor's testimony, a name, an address, and did not act on it. The building's drainage system, overwhelmed by the physical evidence of the attacks, did what the police investigation had not. It forced the truth into the open. He was found guilty on 6 counts of taking a life and 2 attempted counts, though he was linked to more victims than those charges reflected. He received a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released from prison. He died in custody in 2018. Later reviews and reporting highlighted what should have happened differently. Stott's complaint had not been treated as an attempted taking of a life. The failure to investigate thoroughly allowed Nilsson to continue taking lives for months after a survivor came forward with a direct account of being attacked. While there was no large-scale formal misconduct inquiry specific to Stott's report, in the way modern oversight groups like the IOPC now operate, the case is widely cited in criminal justice studies as one of the most consequential missed opportunities in British criminal history. It appears in textbooks and case studies on investigation failures. Carl Stott described a direct attempt on his life. He named his attacker and gave the address. Behind that door was the evidence of what he had done. The investigation that could have ended the series of attacks was never launched. Every life Nilsson took after Stott's report is a death that might have been prevented by a different decision at a police desk in 1982. Carl Stott's police report could have stopped a serial offender, but the next woman followed every step the system offered, filed 3 separate protection orders, and it still was not enough to save her or her children. Case 6. Leisa Creer. Leisa Creer filed 3 separate domestic harm protection orders against her husband. Not 1, not 2, 3. Each time she went through the full process. The paperwork, the court appearances, the formal records of what was happening to her and her children. Each filing described the same pattern. Repeated harm, explicit death threats, and direct concerns for the safety of her children. 3 separate filings is a measure of persistence that should not be necessary. The first order should have been enough. The fact that Leisa had to return to the court twice more, going through the same process, describing the same pattern, asking for the same protection, means the situation did not improve after the first order or the second. Each return visit was an update. The danger has not ended. The previous orders did not stop it. She was still in danger. The court filings painted a clear picture. Harm that was not stopping. Threats that were specific and directed. Growing severity. Concerns not just for Leisa, but for the children. Each time she filed, she was telling the court that the situation was continuing and getting worse. Each time, the court recognised the danger. Each time, an order was issued. 3 orders, 3 formal acknowledgements that Leisa Creer was in danger. A protection order prohibits contact, restricts closeness, and in some areas can require firearm surrender. It authorises arrest upon violation, but it does not build a wall between the victim and the offender. It grants law enforcement the authority to act if a breach occurs. That authority only becomes protection if violations are detected and responded to before the offender reaches the person he has been ordered to stay away from. Enforcement depends on timely service, monitoring compliance, rapid police response to reported violations, and court follow-up when breaches occur. Without all of those mechanisms functioning together, the order is a document that recognises danger without preventing it. Multiple high-risk warning signs were present at the same time: prior harm, death threats, worsening after separation, access to means of harm. Each sign individually raises the probability of a fatal outcome. When they converge in a single case, the risk grows dramatically. Domestic harm researchers identify this specific combination as among the most dangerous profiles a case can present. The kind of case where every model and every framework points to the highest level of danger. Research consistently shows the period after a victim files for protection is one of the most dangerous. The offender perceives loss of control. The legal action, rather than stopping him, can be seen as a challenge. For some offenders, the order does not reduce the urgency to act, it speeds it up. The moment a victim takes legal action is the moment many offenders move from threats to action. The system that issues the order often does not account for this. The order is treated as the end of the process, when in reality it can be the beginning of the most dangerous phase. Leisa filed 3 times. Each filing represented both an act of self-protection and, from her husband's perspective, an act of defiance. Each order meant the court had formally sided with Leisa. Each order restricted his access to his family. For offenders in this profile, prior harm, death threats, access to means of harm, that build-up of legal action can create the exact conditions that precede a fatal attack. Leisha's husband carried out a brutal attack. Leisa and her daughters lost their lives. He took his own life. Law enforcement records confirmed the protection orders were on file. Her case has been referenced in discussions about the limits of restraining orders, firearm access in domestic harm situations, high-risk danger assessment models, and the need for coordinated community response systems. Protection orders reduce risk statistically. They save lives. But they do not eliminate risk when the highest danger warning signs are present. The gap between a court acknowledging danger and that acknowledgement becoming physical protection is where the most dangerous cases fall through. Leisa and her daughters are dead. The protection orders that were supposed to keep them safe are still on file. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Leisa Creer's protection orders recognised the danger but could not stop it. But in the next case, police actually had the physical evidence in their hands. Items purchased by the stalker found steps from the victim's daily location, and they filed it as lost property. Case 7. Gracie Spinks. Gracie Spinks was 23 years old. She lived in Derbyshire and kept a horse at stables in Duckmanton. Part of her routine, a place she went regularly, a place that was woven into the pattern of her daily life. A man named Michael Sellers had worked at the same company as Gracie. Their connection was limited to the workplace. After that contact ended, Sellers did not move on. He fixated. Unwanted communications followed, sustained, uninvited attention that continued long after every legitimate reason for contact had ended. Stalking risk frameworks identify obsession following barely knowing each other as a high-risk pattern, particularly when the offender demonstrates fixation even after all connection has been severed. Gracie reported the behaviour to Derbyshire Constabulary. She told officers she was concerned for her safety. She named Sellers. She described what he was doing. Officers assessed him as low risk. He received informal words of advice, a conversation, not a charge, not an arrest, not a formal stalking prosecution. The assessment was that the situation did not warrant a more serious response. From Sellers' perspective, the message was clear. He had been spoken to, and nothing else had happened. No arrest, no prosecution, no ongoing monitoring. The informal response told him something about the system's view of his behaviour, and that information shaped what he did next. Then, in May 2021, a member of the public found a bag near Gracie's stables. Inside the bag were a hammer, an axe, and knives. These were not household tools casually left behind. This was a collection of dangerous items. There was also a receipt. That receipt was traceable to Michael Sellers, the same man Gracie had named in her stalking complaint. Police logged the discovery as found property. The bag was not connected to her complaint. Sellers was not contacted. The risk assessment was not updated. The information needed to make the connection already existed within the same police force. Gracie's complaint named Sellers. The receipt named Sellers. The bag was found at the stables Gracie frequented. One cross-reference, checking whether the name on the receipt matched any suspect in an active complaint tied to that location, would have linked them. That check was not made. The item sat in evidence for weeks. Gracie was not informed. No officer reviewed whether the name matched an active case. 4 weeks passed between the discovery of the bag and Gracie's death. During those 4 weeks, Gracie continued her routine. She went to the stables. She cared for her horse. She moved through her daily life in a location that Sellers had already identified, already surveilled, and already placed items near. The evidence of the threat was in police custody. The woman the threat was directed at was going to the same place every day. The clock ran for 4 weeks. On June 18, 2021, Sellers lay in wait near the stables. He attacked Gracie. She did not survive. He was found at the scene. The item was consistent with the type found in the bag that had been in police custody for weeks. The attack was planned. The items had been placed near the stables in advance, placed there deliberately, weeks before what happened, in preparation for what Sellers intended to do. The bag was not a coincidence. It was a plan. Sellers had purchased the items, transported them to the location where Gracie spent her time, concealed them nearby, and left them in position. The evidence of that plan had been found by a member of the public and turned over to police. It had been in police custody while the plan moved forward. The IOPC investigation concluded that missed opportunities occurred at multiple points. The bag should have triggered an immediate upgrade. The initial risk rating was flawed. Communication failures prevented connected information from being reviewed together. The systems meant to flag related intelligence did not function. Derbyshire Constabulary formally apologised to Gracie's family. Disciplinary proceedings followed. In Gracie Spinks' case, police failed to connect the evidence they already had. But in the next case, the police did everything right. Prosecutors argued against bail, and a judge overruled them and set the offender free. Case 8. Jane Clough. Jane Clough was 26 years old and worked as a nurse at Blackpool Victoria Hospital. She was a healthcare professional, someone whose daily work involved caring for other people. She had been in a relationship with a man named Jonathan Vass. When the relationship ended, Jane did not stay silent about what had happened during it. She came forward. She reported 9 serious charges, repeated physical attacks, threats, controlling behaviour. She told authorities she feared for her life. She was pregnant with Vass's child at the time she was reporting him. The pregnancy added a dimension that made the case even more urgent. Jane was carrying the child of the man she was accusing of assaulting her. That fact created an inescapable connection between them, a biological tie that Vass could attempt to leverage, and that made complete separation practically impossible without legal help. Pregnancy in domestic harm cases is itself a recognised risk factor. It represents a period of heightened physical risk and emotional complexity for the victim, and for some offenders, it triggers increased need for control. These were not vague allegations. 9 separate, serious charges represent a sustained pattern of harm within the relationship. Combined with physical attacks, threats, and controlling behaviour, the picture Jane presented to authorities described a relationship defined by coercion, harm, and fear. Charges were brought against Vass. The Crown Prosecution Service recognised the severity of what Jane had reported and the danger she was in. Prosecutors formally opposed bail. They argued, on the record, in court, that releasing Vass while awaiting trial put Jane at unacceptable risk. The prosecution's position was clear. This man should not be free pending trial, because the woman he was charged with assaulting was at risk of further harm. A judge granted bail with conditions. 9 alleged assaults, multiple attacks, a pregnant victim, the prosecution directly arguing against release. The court let him walk. Bail conditions are designed to manage risk, restrictions on where a defendant can go, requirements to check in with authorities, prohibitions on contacting specific individuals. The theory is that conditions, when properly enforced, allow the defendant to remain free while keeping the victim safe. In practice, bail conditions rely on the defendant choosing to comply and on enforcement systems detecting violations before the offender can act on his intent. When the charges involve 9 serious charges and the prosecution has formally warned that release creates danger, the question is whether conditions alone can bridge the gap between a courtroom and the victim's daily life. While on bail, Vass travelled to the hospital where Jane worked. He knew where she would be. He knew her schedule. He waited in the car park. The mechanics of what happened next reveal what bail conditions cannot prevent. Vass was not supposed to contact Jane. He was not supposed to approach her. But bail conditions do not create a physical barrier. They do not install surveillance on the defendant. They do not post an officer at the victim's workplace. They create a legal consequence for violation, but that consequence only materializes after the violation has already occurred. For Jane, the violation and the attack were the same event. When she arrived for her shift, the place where she served as a nurse, what should have been an ordinary working day, he harmed her. He struck her 71 times. 71. That number was entered into the court record. It was cited in the prosecution's case as evidence of both the ferocity and the planning behind the attack. This was not a single act of aggression. It was sustained, deliberate, and carried out with the kind of intent that leaves no room for any interpretation other than intent to end a life. Vass had travelled to her workplace. He had waited. He had come prepared. He had carried out what happened in a hospital car park, a place where people go to heal. She died from her injuries. Vass fled and was later arrested. He had been free to do all of it because a court decided that bail conditions were sufficient to manage the risk that prosecutors had directly warned about. Found guilty. Life sentence with a minimum term. The court heard the same evidence Jane had provided before her death. The allegations, the reports, the documented fear. The same evidence that had been available when the bail decision was made. Her case prompted national debate about bail decisions in domestic harm cases. The question was direct. Does a judge's choice in granting bail adequately protect victims when the charges involve intimate partner harm? Prosecutors had warned on the record that Vass should not be free. The court disagreed. Vass used that freedom to travel to Jane's workplace, wait for her, and attack her 71 times. Jane's parents became public advocates for bail reform. They argued that when a victim has come forward, charges have been filed, and bail has been formally opposed, the system has a responsibility to keep the accused away from the victim until trial. Her case contributed to stricter bail conditions in domestic harm cases and greater weight given to victim safety in bail hearings across the United Kingdom. The structural lesson here is different from the other cases. The police did not dismiss Jane's complaint. The prosecution brought charges and formally argued against bail. The failure occurred at the court level. The decision to release a man facing 9 serious charges to carry out an attack. The danger was documented, charged, and argued before a judge. That single decision, bail granted over prosecution objection, created the gap Vass used to reach Jane and end her life. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. Jane Clough's case failed at the court level, but the next case failed at the most basic level of all. The officer who showed up at the victim's door, ran the risk assessment, and got the answer wrong. Case 9. Rianne Tani. In the weeks before she died, Rianne Tani repeatedly contacted Greater Manchester Police. She reported controlling and coercive behaviour from her ex-partner, Daniel Patton. She described growing threats. She described a situation that was getting worse, and she told officers something specific, the kind of disclosure that risk assessment frameworks are directly designed to capture and act on immediately. She told them that Patton had threatened to end her life. A death threat is not an abstract warning sign. It is not a vague warning sign that something might be wrong. It is one of the strongest individual predictors of domestic harm cases ending in death identified in research. Risk assessment frameworks used by police forces across the United Kingdom are built around disclosures like this one. When a victim reports a direct threat to their life, the system is supposed to respond at the highest level. A high-risk rating activates a multi-agency safety net, specialist referrals, joint response, direct safeguarding measures placed around the victim. It is the system's most serious response, reserved for the situations that carry the greatest danger. Officers visited Rianne. They conducted an assessment. They applied the rating tools, standard, medium, or high, designed to evaluate the level of danger based on the information the victim provides. The visit itself can create a false sense of security. An officer arrives, questions are asked, forms are filled out. The victim sees the system in motion and may believe that the process underway will lead to protection. But the visit is not the protection. The visit is the data collection. What happens after the visit, the rating, the referral, the response, is where protection lives or dies. For Rianne, the visit happened. The rating that followed did not match the threat she had described. They labelled it at a level that did not reflect what she was telling them. A death threat, combined with controlling behaviour and worsening after separation, should have placed Rianne in the highest risk category. It did not. The difference between a correct rating and an incorrect one is not administrative. It is operational. The correct grading would have activated immediate action. The incorrect one left her in the same situation, having reported, having been visited, and having received no meaningful upgrade in response. 8 days passed between the final police visit and the fatal attack. Nothing changed. No enhanced monitoring, no emergency referral, no upgrade to specialist units. Those 8 days are the gap at the centre of this case. Rianne had done what the system asks victims to do. She had called. She had described the threat. Officers had visited her home. They had conducted an assessment. And then the system produced a number, a risk level. That determined what happened next. The number was wrong. For 8 days, the wrong number stood between Rianne and the response that could have protected her. In August 2019, Daniel Patton took Rianne's life. He was found guilty of the charges, life imprisonment. The full scope of what went wrong became clear 6 years later. In 2025, an inquest examined the police response in detail. The inquest process in the United Kingdom establishes facts surrounding a death. It does not assign criminal liability, but it can determine whether organisational failures contributed to the circumstances. In Rianne's case, the jury's findings were specific and clear. Police failings contributed to missed opportunities to protect her. The risk grading was inaccurate. Safeguarding steps were insufficient. The explicit death threat was not properly flagged. Her case reinforces a pattern visible across this series. The tools exist. The frameworks exist. But when the officer conducting the visit applies them incorrectly, the entire system breaks down at the point of contact, the exact moment where design meets reality. Rianne Tani's risk assessment failed one woman over 8 days, but the final case involves a police force that failed to connect 4 separate deaths in the same neighbourhood over 15 months, while a forged farewell note sat unexamined. Case 10. The victims of Stephen Port. Between June 2014 and September 2015, 4 young men were found lifeless in Barking, East London. All 4 were found within a small area of the same residential area. All 4 deaths involved GHB, gamma-hydroxybutyrate, a substance that would later become central to the case. All 4 men had met the same person online. His name was Stephen Port. Each death initially appeared to involve a drug overdose. Despite the similarities in location, circumstances, drug tests, and victim profile, the deaths were not formally linked for over a year. During that period, Port was able to continue taking lives. The first victim was Anthony Walgate. He was 23 years old. In June 2014, he was found lifeless outside Port's flat in Barking. Port himself had called emergency services. He said Walgate had collapsed after an overdose. Police did not treat the scene as suspicious. Port was later charged with perverting the course of justice and possession of a controlled drug, but not with taking a life. The investigation stopped at that point. It did not identify Port as a continuing threat. This was the first decision in a chain that would cost 3 more lives. A man had been found lifeless directly outside the flat of the man who reported it. The caller's own account contained conflicting details. The substance involved, GHB, is associated with being drugged first. Any one of those facts, examined more closely, could have widened the investigation. Together, they painted a picture that warranted far more review than it received. Instead, Port was processed on lesser charges and the case closed. 2 months later, it happened again. In August 2014, Gabriel Cavari was found lifeless in a churchyard near Port's address. He was 22. His death was blamed on GHB intoxication, the same drug involved in Walgate's death. Same area, same substance, same kind of victim. The closeness to the first death, a man found lifeless 2 months earlier, steps away, with the same drug, was not treated as the beginning of a pattern. No formal link was established. The investigations existed separately, handled as unrelated incidents despite the overlap. Port remained free. In September 2014, Daniel Whitworth was found lifeless in the same churchyard. He was 21. A handwritten farewell note was recovered from where he was found. That note was forged. Stephen Port had written it himself to make the death look self-inflicted. He created a false narrative, and the Metropolitan Police accepted it without challenge. No forensic handwriting comparison was conducted. No one checked whether the writing matched Whitworth's. No one compared it to Port's handwriting. The existence of the forged note reveals something about Port that separates this case from a random act. He was not simply taking lives. He was managing the aftermath. He was actively creating cover stories, manufacturing evidence, and placing false explanations next to where his victims were found. This is the behavior of a predator who is aware of the investigation process and is working to manipulate it. The note was designed to answer the question the police would ask: why did this man die? And to answer it in a way that ended the inquiry before it reached Port's door. It worked. A young man was found lifeless in the same spot where another man had died a month earlier, with the same drug in his system, and a handwritten note was treated as sufficient explanation. 3 men are gone. Same area, same drug. A forged note accepted without examination. The cases are still not connected. The families saw what the investigators did not. Between the deaths, they raised concerns with police. They pointed to the similarities: the location, the substance, the victim profiles. They asked why the deaths were not being treated as linked. They asked the questions that should have been asked from the beginning. Those concerns were not acted upon. The cases remained separated in the system, handled as individual overdoses or self-harm, rather than as a connected series. The inquest and later commentary raised difficult questions about whether the victims' identities contributed to the investigation failures. All 4 men were young, all were gay or bisexual, all had met Port through social media or dating apps. Advocacy groups and the victims' families argued that the deaths of young gay men were not treated with the same urgency or careful investigation that other deaths might have received. The inquest did not make a formal finding on this point, but the question remains part of the case's legacy, a question about who the system works hardest to protect and whose deaths it is most willing to explain away. Nearly a year passed between the 3rd and 4th deaths. During that time, the investigations did not move forward. The cases sat where they had been filed: individual overdoses and self-harm. The forged note remained unexamined. The family's concerns remained unaddressed. For nearly 12 months, Port lived freely in the same neighbourhood where 3 men had died in circumstances that pointed to him. The pattern that would later become the foundation of a criminal prosecution was already visible in the evidence. No one assembled it. In September 2015, Jack Taylor was found lifeless in the same vicinity. 25 years old. Only after the 4th death did police begin treating the cases as connected. Port was arrested in October 2015. At trial in 2016, Stephen Port was found guilty on 4 counts of taking a life, along with multiple serious charges and administering poison. He received a whole life order, the most severe sentence available in the English legal system. No possibility of parole. He would die in prison. The courts found that Port had used GHB to drug his victims before taking their lives. The full scope of what he had done, the method, the planning, the repetition, was laid out during the proceedings. In 2021, an inquest jury concluded that police failures probably contributed to 3 of the 4 deaths. The jury found that proper investigation after Anthony Walgate's death could have prevented the later killings. That finding carries extraordinary weight. It means that, on the balance of evidence, 3 men, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor, would likely be alive if the first death had been investigated as what it was. The inquest did not use the word probably loosely. It was a formal determination, reached after examining the evidence, that the investigation failures were not merely process failures, They were contributing factors in the deaths of 3 people. The families had raised concerns during the period between the deaths. They had pointed to the similarities. They had asked why the cases were not being linked. Those questions were not taken seriously until the 4th man was dead. The Metropolitan Police formally apologised. The case led to recommendations for improved procedures for linking unexplained deaths in close distance and stronger procedures for suspected overdose deaths, requiring more thorough investigation before a death can be classified as accidental or self-inflicted. 4 men, 15 months, the same neighbourhood, the same drug, the same man responsible. The families saw the pattern before the police did. 10 cases, 10 warnings. All reported, all documented, all ignored. Every reform that followed exists because someone lost their life after asking for help. The question is whether the next person who calls the police and asks for help will find themselves standing in front of the same gap between what the system knew and what the system did. If you enjoyed this deep dive into victims who filed police reports about the person who harmed them and were ignored, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.